Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Hemingway's Key West by Stuart B. Mciver, narrated by David Colacci. Chapter 1. Islands in the Stream. Ernest Miller Hemingway was born on July 21, 1899, in Oak Park, Illinois, a suburb of the Windy City, as the cold northern metropolis of Chicago was called without affection on those days when icy winds swept in from Lake Michigan. After World War I, he lived in Paris, where the rich intellectual and artistic climate was warm and inviting to a young writer, but the winters were cold and wet. In the spring of 1928, he sought out for the first time the heat of the islands in the stream, the Gulf Stream. His goal that April was Florida's southernmost island, Key West. The ship bearing Ernest and his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer, stopped briefly in Cuba, which lay on the south side of the stream. Key West lay roughly 90 miles away on the north side of the Gulf Stream. The warm currents of the Gulf of Mexico accelerate as they flow through the narrows between Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula and the Florida Keys. The stream then turns east through the Florida Straits before veering north past the Bahama Islands and the fishing paradise called Bimini. Continuing their northern flow, the soothing waters of the stream eventually bring warmth to Bermuda, the British Isles, and such icy islands as Iceland and Greenland. However, the northern islands are not the ones that enthralled Hemingway. Key West, Bimini, Cuba. These are the three islands in the stream that claimed the allegiance of Hemingway for the final 3 decades of his life. Of the three, only Cuba lies south of the Tropic of Cancer, thus qualifying it as a tropical island. But both Key West and Bimini are generally regarded as tropical isles, partly because of their heat, their palm trees, and the beauty of the waters surrounding them, and partly because, in a phrase not known in Hemingway's day, they were laid back. These were easy-going, unconventional locales where a man could soothe a thirst, stroll around barefooted all year long, and go about his business free from the pressures of too much civilization. Key West was and is a small town, as is Alice Town, the largest town on Bimini. Havana, by contrast, is a big, sprawling city, the largest in the Caribbean, known from early colonial times as the Pearl of the Antilles. For his Cuban home, Hemingway chose to live not in the bustling, energetic capital, but in San Francisco de Paula, a small town west of Havana. In addition to year-round hot weather, all three islands had in common one major asset: fishing. As a boy, Ernest turned to the streams of northern Michigan. Casting for freshwater fish tested his sporting skills. Catching the giant sea creatures of the Gulf Stream required much more than skill. It demanded strategy, strength, endurance, and knowledge of the behavior of the huge fish and the other ocean predators that might also be seeking the same game as the deep-sea angler. Fishing in the stream was for Hemingway a challenge, and he was a man who pursued challenge. His biggest challenge, of course, was to reach for new heights in literature. His years on the islands were productive, but only 2 of his novels were about the sea. In one, The Old Man and the Sea, he achieved a masterpiece. As for the other, Islands in the Stream, we will never know how great it might have been. Published after his death, it lacked the final meticulous revision he brought to his best work. The reader has to settle for many wonderful passages, settings, and characters. All 3 of his islands have changed since his death some 4 decades ago, but one thing has proved constant. The presence of Ernest Hemingway remains alive and well in Key West, Bimini, and Cuba, Hemingway's Islands in the Stream. Chapter 2. Bone Key. Just the place for Ol' Hem to dry out his bones. That was the recommendation John Dos Passos made to fellow novelist Ernest Hemingway. And, in fact, Hemingway's bones could use a good drying out. He had spent another cold, wet winter in his apartment on Paris's left bank. Key West was a perfect choice for a man with cold bones. The island had once been called Cayo Hueso, Spanish for Bone Key. It was supposedly the site of an ancient Indian massacre that had left its sands covered with sun-bleached skeletons. The bones had long ago been cleared out, but part of the name stuck. Cayo Hueso was anglicized into Key West. The southernmost city in the United States, Key West was well placed to pour on all the heat the author could stand. It missed being a tropical island by less than 100 miles, a whim of geography that did little to compromise the Key's Caribbean spirit, laid back, relaxed, tolerant. In every sense, Key West, some 7,000 miles to the southwest of Paris, was a far cry from the French metropolis. By the 1920s, the cosmopolitan French metropolis had become the artistic and intellectual capital of the world, home of Picasso, Chagall, Dali, Cubism, Art Deco, Dada, the Ballet Russe, Nijinsky, Pavlova, Le Jazz Hot, Coco Chanel, James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, and not incidentally Ernest Hemingway. Key West was, by contrast, a mess. By 1928, its population had shrunk from 26,000 to 10,000. Jobs were moving away as fast as a hooked tarpon's run. A blight had wiped out the sponge industry. The Cuban cigar industry moved away to Tampa, leaving little but the rhythms of Spanish speech and the aroma of black bean soup. With onions. Conks eked out a living by fishing commercially or by smuggling booze from Havana. No wonder Ernest dubbed the town the Saint-Tropez of the poor. Key West had no literary, no artistic, no intellectual life. Hemingway would change that. The island the expatriate writer had planned to visit as a vacation hideaway would become the only American city where he could live and work as an adult. Just the place for Ole Hem to dry out his bones. Ernest Hemingway first saw Key West in April 1928. That spring he and his second wife, Pauline Pfeiffer Hemingway, 5 months pregnant, sailed from Marseille to Havana. From there they boarded a peninsular and occidental steamship bound for the island, just 90 miles away. As the ship crossed the swift, dark Gulf Stream and maneuvered through the Florida Reef, he gazed across clear aqua waters and saw ahead a flat, grayish mass, broken only by the town's skyscraper, the 7-story Colonial Hotel, rising like a thick Key West cigar from a clump of wooden, mostly unpainted buildings. Only as the ship steamed closer could he begin to make out the island's colors, the brilliant tropical foliage, bougainvillea, hibiscus, oleander, interspersed with green palm fronds. The heat bothered the Hemingways. Ernest was not dressed for Key West. He was wearing a necktie, hardly part of the town's dress code. Pregnancy made the weather harder for Pauline to take. She wanted her baby born in the United States, but clearly not in a hot, humid, run-down backwater like Key West. The couple planned to stay in Key West only about 6 weeks, and then drive to Piggott, Arkansas, the ancestral home of the Pfeiffers. Shortly before noon they cleared customs, and Ernest began looking for the Model A Ford Roadster Pauline's wealthy Uncle Gus had bought for them. Unfortunately, the car had not yet arrived from Miami. Ernest telephoned the Trevor and Morris Company, the local Ford dealership. Apologetic that the car was late, the dealers insisted that the couple take up residence at one of the Trevors and Morris apartments, upstairs over the garage. A sweat-drenched, irritated Hemingway agreed. He called a taxi to take them and their luggage the 4 blocks from the P&O docks to their new quarters at 314 Simonton Street. Without the delay, Hemingway's stay in Key West might have been a short one. Fortunately, he stayed long enough to realize that the island was right for him. Once he got the necktie off, he enjoyed the bone-warming heat. He promptly went to work on a half-finished manuscript that would become a farewell to arms. In Paris, he had lived and worked in an apartment above a sawmill. Now he found himself trying to complete his novel above a small-town garage. It was, he remarked, a kind of irony he could damn well do without. Alvin Moreland, a Florida travel writer, visited the island as a boy during the early Hemingway years. A story he wrote later gave some of the flavor of the times. "We arrived in Key West during the siesta hour when most businesses were closed, but the aroma of strong Cuban coffee permeated the downtown area. The unpainted homes, weathered gray, had balconies. Their sloping roofs were designed to funnel rainwater into pipes leading to cisterns, the only source of fresh water in the city. There seemed to be ice cream parlors in every block of the commercial section, and we wasted no time in trying such exotic flavors as coconut, sugar apple, and sapodilla. Later we sampled marquitas, fried green plantains sliced as thin as potato chips." Soon after he settled in, Hemingway received a letter forwarded from Paris. The letter informed him that his parents, Dr. Clarence Hemingway, a physician, and his wife Grace, were in Florida. His father, whose home was in Oak Park, Illinois, was inspecting land he owned in St. Petersburg. Actually, Ernest's parents were a good bit closer. The writer was fishing from the Trumbo Pier when he heard a familiar bobwhite whistle. It was the family signal. He looked up and saw his father waving to him from a P&O steamship. Ernest was saddened to observe his father's deteriorating health. He was, however, glad that his parents got along quite well with Pauline. The four of them had dinner downtown, probably at Delmonico's on 218 Duval Street. For 50 cents, the restaurant featured a representative Cuban Key West dinner of arroz con pollo, green turtle steak, fish, and Spanish garbanzos. After a tour of the island guided by Ernest, the Hemingways boarded the 5:40 p.m. train for Miami. A week after Ernest and Pauline landed at Key West, Uncle Gus's yellow roadster was delivered. Soon Hemingway was driving up the highway some 20 miles to the no-name Key ferryboat docks and fishing from the landing there. One day Georgie Brooks, prosecuting attorney for Monroe County, was waiting for the ferryboat from Lower Matacombe Key. He noticed a new face, a big, rugged fisherman wearing canvas shorts, a fish-stained pullover shirt, a cap, and dirty tennis shoes. No doubt about it, the man looked suspicious. Scars above his right knee, from an Austrian .420 shell wound in World War I, and a particularly nasty purple scar above his right eye. Could the man with the rod and reel be a lawbreaker on the run, or another bootlegger? Striking up a conversation with him, Brooks soon put his suspicions to rest. The man was writing a book, he said, and resting up after a bloody, awful winter in Paris. Hemingway probably dodged around any questions about the purple scar, the result of an embarrassingly bizarre accident in France. In the wee hours of a cold March morning he had gone to the bathroom in his apartment. He had sleepily reached up for the chain to flush the toilet. Instead, he grasped the cord to the skylight. The glass came crashing down on his head. 9 stitches in an emergency room at 3 a.m. had closed the nasty wound. Hemingway asked Brooks if he knew anyone with a boat who would be willing to share fishing expenses. The attorney told him to go to the Thompson hardware store on Caroline Street and introduce himself to Charles Thompson. "He likes to fish as well as any man I know," said Brooks. "He'll take you out. Just tell him I sent you by." The lawyer would become one of Hemingway's closest friends, but not as close as the man he sent him to see. Ernest picked up his rod and reel and the hog snappers he had caught and drove back to Key West. Clad in khakis, Charles, a member of the island's most affluent family, was standing behind a counter when Hemingway walked in. Their handshake initiated one of the most enduring friendships of the author's life. They made arrangements to go out fishing the next evening. After he closed the store, Charles walked to his home at 1029 Fleming Street. That night he told his wife, Laureen, about the man he had met. "Georgie Brooks sent him by. Says his name's Hemingway. Said George told him I liked to fish and might take him out. Says he's written a couple of books. A couple of books? By April 1928, the 29-year-old Hemingway already had 6 published books to his credit, most notably Men Without Women, a volume of short stories, and the internationally acclaimed novel The Sun Also Rises. He was a celebrity in Paris and in much of the United States, but in Key West he was an unknown, and he liked it that way. Chapter 3. Hemingway's Mob. The day after Hemingway met Thompson, the two of them boarded Charles's 18-foot powerboat and followed the channel through Key West Bight to the Gulf of Mexico. An evening of fishing brought them several sizable tarpon, a fighting game fish known as the Silver King. The magic of Key West was beginning to seduce Ernest. Free of distractions, he could concentrate on a farewell to arms during the mornings, then relax in the afternoons or evenings with a rod and reel. Soon Thompson invited the Hemingways over to dinner at their home, only a few blocks away from the Trevor and Morris apartments. Lorene entertained them in true Key West style. She had Phoebe, her black Bahamian cook, prepare a conch dinner for the visitors, who had only recently dined in the brasseries of Paris. Phoebe cooked black beans and yellow rice and a Keys delicacy, green turtle steak. One of the many businesses of the affluent Thompson family was a cannery that processed turtle meat for steaks and soup. To round out the meal, Phoebe served them a raw conch meat salad and Cuban bread. Ernest brought a European touch to the occasion with several bottles of good red Chianti wine. Hemingway lavishly praised the island cooking. Phoebe was delighted. "That man Hemingway one fine eater," she said. Ernest also offered impressive proof that he was indeed an author. He gave Charles a copy of The Sun Also Rises, inscribed, "To Charles Thompson from his friend Ernest Hemingway, Key West, 1928, and a copy of Men Without Women, with an even more personal message, "To Charles Thompson with all best wishes and many tarpon, from his friend Ernest Hemingway, Key West, 1928. It was a good evening for all concerned. Ernest and Charles had a few scotches after dinner, then walked along tree-shaded Fleming Street, talking about hunting and fishing. Pregnant Pauline, increasingly uncomfortable in the stuffy apartment, relaxed with Lorene on the Thompsons' breezy front porch. As they talked, a bond began to form between them that paralleled the closeness their husbands were building. The two men and the two women would remain friends the rest of their lives. A native of Georgia, Lorene graduated from Agnes Scott College in Decatur, near Atlanta, in 1919. 2 years later, she came to Key West to teach social science and soon became head of the social science department at Key West High School. She married Charles on September 6, 1923. Pauline, an heiress, had graduated from the University of Missouri. In France, she had been a fashion writer for the Paris edition of Vogue magazine. The two women found they had much in common. Both had been born in rural communities in the South, both had been well educated, and both had moved out into a bigger world. Pauline's father, Paul Pfeiffer, president of the Piggott Custom Gin Company, came to Key West to see his new son-in-law. Pauline and Ernest installed him in the Key West Colonial Hotel, the town's 7-story skyscraper. Pauline, anxious to get away from the heat, wanted the three of them to drive to Piggott. Ernest protested. He finally agreed to let her leave early by train with a promise that he and her father would follow shortly. Hemingway liked to surround himself with a circle of cronies, a mob. He sent out letters inviting a number of old friends to join him in the Saint-Tropez of the poor. He wrote to 2 artist friends, Henry Strader and Waldo Pierce, Bill Smith, a boyhood friend from Horton Bay, Michigan, and John Dos Passos. While awaiting their arrival, he added to his mob a number of locals whose company he enjoyed. With the exception of Charles, most of them were saddled with colorful nicknames. Joe Russell, a conch who owned 2 basic generators of income, a charter boat and a speakeasy, was Josie, or Sloppy Joe, a name he gave to a legal bar he opened after Prohibition was repealed. 4 other charter boat fishermen were mobsters: Hamilton Adams, Sack of Ham, or Sacker, Captain Eddie Saunders, Bra, and his half-brother, Captain Burge Saunders, and Jakey Key. A local newspaperman, Earl Adams, became Jewfish. Adams, who became a close friend, was Key's bureau chief for the Miami Herald. During his newspaper days, he also worked for the Key West Citizen, the Key West Morning Journal, and the Baltimore International News. J.B. Sullivan, an Irishman who owned a machine shop, was Sully. Ernest had his share of nicknames. He was called the Old Master, and after being observed with a towel wrapped around his head, he was also classified as the Mahatma. Later, in Key West, he would assume the father-image name he liked best, Papa. By the last week in May, all the out-of-town talent had arrived. Dos Passos, Doss, Henry Strader, Mike, Waldo Pierce, Don Pico, and Bill Smith, Old Bill. Bypassing the island's luxury hotel, the Casa Marina, with rooms from $7, Ernest booked them into the 100-room Overseas Hotel, a 3-story wood hostelry at 917 Fleming Street. Room rates, $1 a day. Charles pronounced them as grand a group of men as ever came together. Thompson connections gave them access to the clear, blue-green waters at the Navy Yard. There the men swam together and cheered and jeered at Hemingway's specialty dive, a combination of belly-buster and swan dive. They called it the Heming Swan. For breakfast, they liked the bare-bones electric kitchen, a 1-story wooden building at 830 Fleming Street. The owner and cook was Mrs. Rhoda Baker, better known as Rutabaga. A club breakfast at the electric kitchen cost 20 to 45 cents. Lunch and dinner, 30 to 50 cents. When they went together as a group for dinner, they usually picked Delmonico's or Ramon's, both on Duval Street. Some of their dinners were enjoyed at the Thompsons' home, where they feasted on the cooking of Phoebe. After one of Phoebe's dinners, they often strolled east on Fleming Street to Valladares Bookstore, where they browsed through books and magazines. Leonte Valladares, a 30-year-old Cuban, had agreed to stock Hemingway's hardback books. He charged $1 extra for autographed copies of The Sun Also Rises and Men Without Women. Through Valladares, Hemingway subscribed to the New York papers, the Times, the Herald Tribune, the World Telegram, the Mirror, and the Daily News. The papers were delivered by the proprietor's young son, Arthur. He recalled his first meeting with Hemingway. "He came into my father's store wearing moccasins and a pair of shorts held up with a rope. 'This man is poor. He doesn't have a belt,' I said to my father in Spanish. What I didn't know was that Hemingway understood Spanish. He picked me up and sat me down in his lap and told me in Spanish an Indian legend about how moccasins were made." A rowdy bunch, the mob liked to carouse in the evenings. One of their favorite places was Raoul's Club on East Roosevelt Boulevard, commanding a view of the Atlantic. A live orchestra played and couples danced on the finest dance floor in the city. A bizarre feature was a tank of groupers trained by Raoul Vasquez himself to perform in their tank as he fed them by hand. In Old Town they visited Peña's Garden of Roses, a beer garden nestled among rose bushes. Another popular spot was the Tropical Club, on the corner of Front and Fitzpatrick Streets. Its sign called it the place where good fellows get together. At 1111 Duval Street, they visited the Cuban Café, which offered foreign and domestic beer, anything you want. To cap off the first assembling of the mob, Ernest planned a weekend fishing trip to the Dry Tortugas. He hired Captain Bra Saunders and his charter boat, along with Bra's brother Burge as mate. On a Friday afternoon in the third week in May, they set out for the islands west of Key West. Ernest, Doss, Don Pico, Mike, and the poet Archibald MacLeish, an old friend from Paris who had joined them in Key West. Charles trailed Captain Bra's charter boat in his 18-footer. Burge rowed with him. Just before dusk they anchored in the Marquesas Islands. They swam in the clear waters near their boat and caught fish for dinner, unaware that underneath the Gulf's sandy bottom lay the $300 million treasure of the Nuestra Senora de Atocha, a Spanish galleon wrecked on the reef in 1622. Next morning at dawn they arose for a breakfast of thick Cuban coffee, Cuban bread, avocados, and smoked fish. Both boats went out in quest of the Silver King, the giant tarpon for which the Marquesas were famous. The prize went to the rugged, bearded Waldo Pierce, who battled a 183.5-pound tarpon for 2 hours before pulling it to shore. Early the next morning, a low-pressure ridge convinced Charles, a man who knew the vagaries of Key's weather, that he had better head his 18-footer back to safe harbor closer to Key West. Captain Bra's charter boat continued its westward cruise toward the Dry Tortugas. Just before dark, Captain Bra tied up at the docks at historic Fort Jefferson. Built before the Civil War as a defense outpost and coaling station, Fort Jefferson later became famous as the prison that housed Dr. Samuel Mudd, the Maryland doctor who set the broken leg of John Wilkes Booth after the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln. Don Pico's fishing skills deserted him in the Tortugas. He hooked, then lost 7 straight tarpon before landing one. The following morning they left Fort Jefferson for the 10-hour cruise back to Key West. The weather conditions that had sent Thompson back early presented no problems for Captain Bra. By the end of May, all of the out-of-town mobsters had left on the FEC train out of Key West. Ernest figured it was time for Paul Pfeiffer and him to join Pauline in Piggott, Arkansas, a 1,400-mile drive. Before leaving, he asked Lorene to find a house for Pauline and him for the next season of 1929. She didn't think he was serious about it. In late May 1928, leaving Key West by automobile was no easy task. Although the railroad had been in place since 1912, US 1, the overseas highway, was missing a few stretches of pavement. They drove to No Name Key, where Ernest had met Georgie Brooks. From there they took the 9 a.m. ferry to Lower Matacumbe Key, a 5-hour trip covering some 41 miles. From the town of Isla Morada, they picked up US 1 and drove across concrete and rickety wooden bridges, finally crossing a long wooden bridge at Ocean Reef. They arrived at Florida City on the mainland just before sunset. The next time Hemingway returned to Key West, in the fall of 1928, he would bring with him a new baby. After an 18-hour labor, Pauline had delivered Patrick Hemingway, a 9.5-pound boy in Kansas City, Missouri, on June 28, 1928. Chapter 4. The House on Whitehead Street. Find us a house for next winter. That's what the Hemingways had asked Lorene Thompson. Then they'd left for Kansas City, where Pauline would give birth to their first child. Charles Thompson did not expect them to return. "It was fun, but we've seen the last of that gang," he said sadly. Charles was wrong. They came back a second and then a third time. Then, in 1930, Ernest told Charles he would like to look around Key West for a place to hang my hat. Nothing came of it, probably because he and Charles were more skilled in hunting down sailfish than houses. What they didn't know was that Lorene had already shown Pauline a big 2-story run-down stone house at 907 Whitehead Street, set on a scrubbily landscaped acre and a half. A miserable wreck of a house, Lorene called it. To Pauline, it was a
Sample complete. Ready to continue?